The abandoned factories spread a deep silence all around. The closing factories and offices everywhere must be shaking your heart. Today, you may see America as the most powerful country in the world, but the images from the last few years of the 1920s and the silence restored by the 30s narrate the time when America was witnessing its roaring 20s quieting down. It was during this period that a new term was born in America, the Great Depression. Yes, this is the same Great Depression that set our country and many others back by 100 years. The situation in America had become so dire that people would queue for hours for free coffee and donuts. Government and municipal employees were suspended indefinitely. Despair and disparity were everywhere. What was this Great Depression that changed the course of history and broke the back of a country like America?
The 1920s, the great American word was prosperity. Now the 30s have begun and there is a new word, depression.
What were the primary causes of the depression, as we called it?
Britain was the world's superpower, and a few European countries ruled over half the world, with America emerging as a leading industrial power. Everything was going well until July 28, 1914, when Austria declared war on Serbia, suspecting them of assassinating their prince in Bosnia, leading to neighboring countries attacking each other. Austria-Hungary was much smaller than Serbia, so it sought Russia's help to fight in the war. Russia, Germany, Italy, and other countries joined the war for their personal reasons, including alliances between countries. This involvement of major countries led to the beginning of World War I. When all of Europe was engulfed in this war, their production halted, causing their economies to plummet, affecting the entire world. The impact was felt widely, and even the colonized nations of Europe were reluctantly drawn into the World War, which also affected their economies. Europe was in dire need of food materials, grains, and weapons, which they could not produce themselves, and America capitalized on this opportunity. America began manufacturing food, goods, and weapons domestically and started exporting them to Europe. New factories opened in America, leading to job creation and boosting the national economy. America's total exports, which were $2.4 billion in 1913, surged to $6.2 billion by 1917. Wealthy Americans profited significantly from the war, with profits for America's largest companies increasing nearly tenfold. American industries and the government realized that there was substantial profit to be made, and thus accelerated the production of new weapons. When the war ended in 1918, Europe was devastated, but by then, America had become strong in every aspect. Consequently, America began offering loans to the war-torn countries, taking gold as collateral in return. Employment was abundant in America, with large factories opening and significant investments pouring in. As people started having disposable income, they began purchasing goods from the market, and America introduced new household items and provided loans for their purchase through newly established banks. America's development was rapid, revolutionizing every sector, marking the beginning of the modern era in the 1920s. This period, known as the Roaring Twenties, saw people indulging in new goods, which increased market demand. As companies grew, their stock values also increased and people began investing in the stock market. This era also saw women gaining the right to vote and the introduction of automobiles, telephones, films, radios into people's lives. The use of electric products significantly increased, and banks began offering loans for people to buy goods and invest in the stock market, leading to a rapid increase in the number of banks. By 1939, there were 17,583 state banks and 8,150 national banks in America. The modern banking system as we know it started during those days. In 1923, the American stock market began to rise and continued to soar, doubling money annually, which led people to invest more and more. Some even mortgaged their homes or took loans from banks and stockbrokers to invest in the stock market. Everything was going well until October 24, 1929, when nearly $5 billion were wiped out from the market in a single day due to overproduction. There were more goods than buyers, directly impacting the stock benefits of companies and causing their stocks to plummet. The market decline continued, and on October 29, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange suffered approximately $14 billion in losses. This day marked the beginning of the Great Depression, a term that became commonly used worldwide to describe the economic downturn. The sudden sale of about 16 million shares in the American stock market led to a widespread panic that the stock market bubble and the ensuing downturn could ruin America. However, the reality was somewhat different. On March 8, 1939, Paul Warburg, the former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve during World War I, warned the president that the American stock market was becoming a speculative bubble, which could lead to dangerous outcomes. Stockbrokers, without following any regulations, would inflate the prices by heavily investing in a particular city's market, and then suddenly sell off all the shares, causing market instability. The value is dropped, making stockbrokers doubly alive while the public suffers double the losses. The president paid no attention to this. After some time, even the Federal Reserve realized this and informed the government. When the Federal Reserve Bank mentioned this, people got scared and started selling their shares, causing the stock market to fall. However, the American National Bank then invested $25 million in the market, causing it to rise again, and people began buying shares again. The common people and the government still didn't understand that this was a collusion between stockbrokers and banks, manipulating the market to their advantage. By June 1929, people's earnings started to stagnate, and at this time, the bank also increased the loan interest rate from 4% to 6%. This led to a decrease in loans and people's buying capacity. On October 22, 1939, the stock market faced its first major decline, and on October 24th it fell by 11% all at once, causing panic among people. Everyone rushed to Wall Street to sell their shares, leading to a huge crowd. Even when the market slightly recovered due to investments from banks and large businesses, people continued selling their shares as their trust had vanished. In October-November 1929, when people's incomes began to decrease, banks and stockbrokers started fearing how people would repay their loans, so they pressured people to repay loans quickly. Some managed to do so by selling their shares, but most were making losses in the stock market and couldn't repay their loans. Gradually, banks that couldn't get their money back started incurring losses and went bankrupt. Seeing this, people who had deposited their money in banks began withdrawing it, but the banks had no funds left. Now, not only those who were giving and taking loans were ruined, but also those who had deposited their money in banks were devastated. In America, most people were left without any money. When people had no money, they were not in a condition to buy anything, and this impacted the farmers as well, especially during the First World War when European countries needed grain. During this time, American farmers increased their production by taking various steps such as buying new machinery, purchasing land, and renting seed. These actions profited the farmers greatly, and they became wealthy. However, when the war ended, the demand for grain decreased, but farmers continued their production because now people were buying grain at lower prices, and farmers wanted to sell more to cover their costs. By 1939, when people's pockets were empty, how could the farmers survive? And so they too ended up on the streets. Production was increasing on one side, and on the other, unemployment was also rising rapidly. The increase in unemployment significantly reduced the income of workers, especially laborers. Layoffs started in factories, and there was an attempt to sell the finished goods at reduced prices, which accelerated the economic crisis. When America saw this, it imposed import duties on goods coming from abroad to save its farmers and businesses, so that goods made in America could be sold more. But not just America, other countries also wanted to correct their economies, and after the war, every country tried to become self-sufficient and recover from the devastation of the war. Seeing America, other countries also imposed higher taxes on goods coming from foreign countries and set quotas on the quantity of goods that could be imported. There was an emphasis everywhere on using domestic goods instead of foreign ones. New laws related to immigration control were also enacted. The consequence was that international business significantly decreased compared to before. The most affected were those countries that were devastated by the war and were preparing to repay loans. They were in dire need of international business, which had now stalled. Additionally, when the situation in America started deteriorating, it began demanding its money back from debtor nations. But those who didn't even have money for food, how could they repay the loans? During the war, America had given loans to countries and in return took gold from them, keeping it. As a result, due to lending to most countries involved in the war, gradually 60% of the world's gold ended up in America. This caused a shortage of gold worldwide, and the value of gold coins increased in various places, breaking the economic backbone of those countries. When America didn't get its loans back, its situation worsened, and the situation in European countries also started deteriorating, because now they had no one to lend them money, nor had production started after the devastation of the World War. When America's deteriorating situation had an impact on war-torn European countries, it also started affecting the entire world, because at that time, European countries predominantly ruled the world. From Europe to Africa and Asia to Australia, various impacts were seen on the economies. The first victim of the economic crisis was Austria. On May 11, 1931, it was revealed that Austria's largest non-governmental bank, Kreditanstalt, was going to declare bankruptcy. This caused panic across European countries, and they started to believe that hoping for loan repayments from monarchies was futile. Germany was more affected because its banking business was already going through a tough phase. At that time, the Austrian government issued a notice to consul people, even going so far as to say that it would take responsibility for all foreign obligations. But the economic crisis had escalated to such an extent that even the government's reassurance couldn't improve the situation, and fear settled among the people in Germany. In just 3 weeks, foreign capitalists withdrew their deposit of 50 million from German banks. This impacted German businessmen as well, and they began withdrawing their deposits from the country's largest financial institutions, Dresdner Bank and Deutsche Bank, for various reasons. As the situation worsened, banks had to be shut down. Subsequently, the government, observing the situation, closed all banks except the Reichsbank for an indefinite period. With the closure of the banks, the recession deepened and people's conditions worsened, particularly affecting the middle class the most. Due to the Great Depression, unemployment in Germany surged, with nearly 6 million people losing their jobs in 1929. This depression also had a significant impact on German politics, tarnishing the image of the ruling authorities, which Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, capitalized on, declaring himself the government. The economic crisis in Germany led to the rise of Nazism. The failure of banks in Austria and Germany also affected Britain, where people began withdrawing their money from the Bank of England, losing faith in banks. When the Bank of England's situation became precarious in July 1931, it secured a loan of 50 million from American and French banks in August to stay afloat. But this did little to restore public confidence, and people continued withdrawing their money from the Bank of England. To combat this economic crisis, Prime Minister MacDonald resigned and formed a national government with the opposition, but this did not restore public trust. On September 18, 1931, £18 million were withdrawn from the bank. Frustrated, the British government stopped valuing its currency according to the gold standard, causing the value of the pound to decrease by a quarter. This benefited England, but had the opposite effect on other European countries, where prices were already declining. Following this, the decline in prices worsened. Most stock exchanges in Europe shut down, and many countries abandoned the gold standard, with only a few like the United States, France, and Italy maintaining it. Due to a shortage of funds in Europe, factories and industries began to close, leading to widespread unemployment. People started selling their land, homes, and vehicles to make ends meet. In the United States, people resorted to living in their cars, and those without cars built shacks for shelter. These shacks, often called Hoovervilles, were named so because many believed President Herbert Hoover was responsible for the nation's plight. The majority of the American populace was on the streets, struggling for basic necessities like shelter and food. Many had to rely on soup kitchens and bread lines provided by organizations and the government. In 1931, dust storms ravaged many American states, covering arable land with dust and halting what little agriculture there was. This forced people to wander in search of work or to leave their homes for other places. There was a 45% decline in manufacturing and an 80% decline in construction in the United States, severely affecting the economy and leading to a quarter of the workforce being laid off. By 1933, the unemployment rate in the United States had exceeded 25%. During the Roaring Twenties, banks had extended excessive loans to people, and during the Great Depression, they attempted to recover these loans. However, people were unable to repay, resulting in over 11,000 banks declaring bankruptcy. The effects of this Great Depression lasted for a decade, significantly impacting the entire world. Poverty and hunger reached a different peak in the world, meaning by 1932 and 1933, the world had been hit by the Great Depression at its peak. Every country was trying to recover from it, but the situation in America was the worst. When people were distressed by the Depression in 1933, they started protesting against the governments. As a result, when elections were held in America in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt became the new president, and he immediately started working on recovering America from this depression through the New Deal program. He introduced regulations for banks, the stock market, and the market, such as the Emergency Banking Bill, the Glass-Steagall Act, the Farm Credit Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Truth in Securities Act, and many other essential bills, reassuring the public that they could now invest their money in banks and the market because it was safe. People showed their trust, and those who had money started investing in banks and the stock market, which led to the stock market beginning to rise again. Additionally, America faced drought every year, for which the president started a campaign to plant trees everywhere, providing employment to many people. America's economy gradually got back on track. Now, banks were not giving loans for investment in the stock market and were giving other loans only after checking all the documents, which reduced the risk of losses for the banks. Work in America began again, and by 1937, the unemployment rate had dropped to 14.3%. While all this was happening, World War II started in Europe in 1939. Europe needed weapons and other goods, which America took advantage of. It restarted its closed factories and began selling newly manufactured modern weapons to Europe, benefiting from the war situation. The scarcity of grains re-emerged, and the condition of American farmers also began to improve. Later in 1941, America also joined the war. By the time World War II ended, America had become strong again and never looked back. As America strengthened, the Great Depression gradually began to fade from the world as well, since the Depression had also started from America. The Great Depression not only caused global damage, but also changed the world. After the end of the Great Depression, various changes occurred worldwide. The Soviet Union was a communist state which isolated itself entirely from the capitalist system. All capitalist countries also ended their business and relations with it, which greatly benefited the Soviet Union, allowing it to protect itself from the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, leaders of major opposition parties started campaigning against the ruling leaders, blaming them entirely for the poor condition of the common people. It was during this recession that fascism was promoted. Many prominent leaders of various countries were in power, but they were removed due to this depression. In Germany, Hitler managed to strengthen his grip on power due to the depression. In Japan, development in Manchurian minis was pursued legally, claiming it would significantly alleviate the Great Depression. Due to the depression, people started wandering hungry and thirsty, leading to the spread of hatred which gradually turned into World War II. During the Great Depression, people became enemies of each other. As the Depression led to the declaration of World War II, countries like America chose weapon manufacturing as the best way to strengthen their economies. They manufactured such weapons that encouraged violence and power in many countries, providing jobs to many Americans and significantly changing domestic production. This is why our country quickly managed to come out of the Great Depression, and after seeing America, many countries started earning huge profits through the same path. After World War II, America implemented the Marshall Plan to strengthen its Western countries. America made a significant contribution to reconstructing the war-torn countries, but its real aim was to completely stop the spread of communism and promote capitalism, so America could benefit from it. For this, America provided $17 billion in aid to European countries, and after that, America's power steadily increased, making it unstoppable. The Great Depression also had an impact on India, although India was under British rule at that time. Most of India's population depended on agriculture, so there was a large production of raw materials. Before the Depression, India had started exporting agricultural products and importing finished goods. During the Depression, when the prices of products in the international market began to fall, the prices of crops also significantly decreased. This resulted in the price of wheat in India falling by 50% between 1928 and 1934, and the import-export business was nearly halved. During this time, farmers and businessmen faced a double blow. With the drop in grain prices, their income decreased, and the British government did not offer any relief in the collection of land revenue. The worst affected were those who produced goods for the world market. Their businesses shut down completely. Not only that, when exports from India decreased, the price of jute also fell by 60%, adversely affecting the jute farming laborers in Bengal, who had started cultivating raw jute in hopes of earning a good income. They were crushed under the burden of debt, and due to the lack of any means of earning, their savings gradually depleted. During this time, not only farmers and agricultural laborers, but also daily wage workers faced a dire scarcity of food. They didn't even have the money for 2 square meals a day. In such circumstances, they started selling their household jewelry in the market to manage their expenses. A large amount of gold began to reach the market, and the British government took full advantage of this desperation. They started exporting metals from India, which improved Britain's economy, but did not change the situation for Indian farmers. In 1931, the Great Depression was at its peak, and due to British rule, the people of India were suffering unnecessarily. It's not that the Great Depression had a uniform impact on everyone in India. Those living in cities with fixed salaries and landlords with fixed incomes were not as affected by the Depression because they had a source of income and didn't have to face the dire conditions like others. The Great Depression, which started in 1929, ended around 1939 after 10 years, making it known as the longest-lasting depression in history.